The Economist. Hello and welcome to The Intelligence from The Economist. I'm Jason Palmer.
And I'm Rosie Blore. Every weekday we provide a fresh perspective on the events shaping your world.
For so many years, the story of the Brazilian rainforest was one of trees coming down. But carbon trading schemes are coming into their own, and plenty of entrepreneurs see opportunity in trees going up.
And we like to think that we're living in a golden age of innovation. But a new ranking shows that we could be fooling ourselves, and that the greatest sources of inspiration may not be in the places we'd assume. But first, the war between Israel and Hizbullah shows little sign of stopping. Last night, say the Lebanese authorities, 13 airstrikes hit southern Beirut. Israeli forces have struck banks linked to the Shia paramilitary group. Thousands in the Lebanese capital have been driven from their homes. Civilian casualties are mounting. And further south, along the border with Israel, the full extent of Hezbollah's fortifications is now becoming clear.
We're walking now into a tiny clearing in the undergrowth on a ridge about 300 meters above the Israeli border with Lebanon. We're on the Lebanese side. There's quite a few squads of soldiers crouched here in the brush around us.
Anshel Pfeffer, our Israel correspondent, recently embedded with Israeli troops in southern Lebanon and visited some Hezbollah bases.
The path here through the undergrowth is quite narrow, but you can occasionally see signs of it being man-made. A small tree trunk has been slashed with a machete. Here and there, a tiny spot of green paint to guide the Hezbollah fighters along this path as they were planning to rush towards the Israeli border with their explosives. Now it's been cordoned off by the Israeli military.
Anshel, you recorded those scenes last week. Tell us why you went to the border region.
We go to these places to try and report as close as we can to the events. The Israeli army, the IDF, opened some of these Hezbollah positions to reporters. Obviously, they want to show how Hezbollah have been preparing for years an attack on Israel of a similar type of last year's October 7th attack by Hamas, but of a much larger scale. And this was a way to kind of see how one of the largest militias in the world was preparing for such an attack.
And Anshel, Israel claims that Hezbollah was planning to join Hamas's October 7th attack. What evidence did you see of that?
Well, from the quantities of explosives there, which in one of the positions which I visited, which were literally prepared a couple of 100 meters from the Israeli border with Lebanon, the types of mines which were there to be just grabbed and rushed to the border fence and then to the border wall, different types of mines, the uniforms, the combat webbing and equipment that were there. According to Israeli officers who I've spoken to, basically these positions were equipped so Hezbollah fighters could arrive there in civilian clothes. One of the officers said they could just jog up there wearing shorts and they would have just everything ready to prepare themselves for the attack. And on this visit to the border, I saw two of these Hezbollah positions. There does seem to have been, at least as the IDF says, hundreds of similar positions across the Israel-Lebanon border.
How characteristic is this?
Most of the IDF forces found quite the same equipment, quite the same size of weapons. We surprised from the quality of these weapons, because everything is made from Iran and Russia.
The real question that I've heard different answers from Israeli officers is whether Hezbollah really was planning to do this on October 7th, but at the last moment, Israeli forces deployed there, so they didn't, or they hadn't been given adequate warning by Hamas and weren't entirely sure themselves what they were planning to do.
So with the Israeli troops now in the border region, is Hezbollah's threat blunted?
I think Hezbollah has many capabilities. We've seen also Israel bombing Hezbollah's long-range missile launchers and storages. We saw just in the last couple of days Israeli planes bombing Hezbollah banks in different parts of Lebanon. These border positions are one more of those capabilities, but we're seeing that Hezbollah is still using short-term rockets firing at northern Israel from various places, and some days as many as 200 rockets. And we're still seeing Hezbollah using quite advanced drone capability that just a couple of days ago hit next to Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister's house. So they're certainly blunted, but still have quite a few of these capabilities that they can use against Israel.
And Anshel, this trip that you're describing was a week ago. And as we know, a week is a long time in the Middle East these days. And a lot has happened since then, including the killing of Sinwar, the Hamas leader in Gaza. How is that changing the picture?
You would expect the killing of Sinwar to be a turning point, something which would perhaps open another opportunity for ceasefire talks. But right now, the Israeli focus is mainly on Lebanon and the airstrikes, which will probably take place very soon against Iran in response to an Iranian missile strike a few weeks ago. And I'm feeling that there isn't really the bandwidth from the Israeli leadership to deal with what's happening in Gaza. At the same time, Lebanon seems to also be at a stage where they need to make a decision soon on what's going to happen. But really the main issue now is when is Israel going to strike Iran? U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is coming here to Jerusalem today, and that will probably be the main issue in the talks. And the expectation is that when Blinken leaves, that will probably be the moment when Israel launches its attack, and we'll see what targets they're hitting, how effective they are, what will be the Iranian response. And I think that will dictate what happens also in Gaza and in Lebanon in the short term.
So essentially, we're talking here about a war on three fronts. Is that sustainable?
That's the question that most Israelis are asking. And when you say sustainable, there's the sustainable from the military point of view. How much forces does Israel have? How many tanks and armored vehicles can it deploy on these fronts? Its air force, how many strikes can it generate a day? And Israeli officers tell me that they're confident that they can continue fighting on these three fronts. But when we talk about the sustainability here, it's not just pure military terms. It's a society, it's an economy, which has been at war now for more than a year and doesn't really know if there's an end in sight. And that's really where the questions of sustainability should be directed at this point.
And you've mentioned that Blinken is visiting now, and we've talked before on the show about the effect of the US election on the conflict. How much do you think we're in a holding pattern until that happens in a couple of weeks?
It's pretty clear that Netanyahu, and I think also other main players in the region, are not going to make big decisions which will have implications for their country's future and for the region's future until they know the identity of the person who's going to be sitting in the White House for the next 4 years. And we're already seeing both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump involved in what's going to happen. Netanyahu has had phone calls in the last few weeks with Trump. In the phone calls that he's had with Joe Biden, Harris has been sitting in on those calls. So already these two people, one of whom will be America's next president, are already involved in the day after the war, in what's going to happen when they're the president, and they will have perhaps a major influence on what happens here in the region.
Anshel, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you for having me, Rosie.
We're sitting in a GPS-guided subsoiler in Mãe do Rio at a farm called Turmalina.
Analikis is a Brazil correspondent for The Economist.
This used to be a gigantic 3,000-hectare cattle ranch, and it was just a bunch of pasture with a few cows on it. And now we are drawing lines in the soil with the subsoiler. And every few meters, you have a spot marked out where the planters then come by and manually plant each little seedling where a new tree will grow.
Earlier this year, I traveled to 2 reforestation projects in the Brazilian Amazon. One project was run by a company called Momback, and the other was run by a company called Regreen. And both of these firms are betting big on the growth of the voluntary carbon market, which is a market where companies basically buy credits to finance things like reforestation or conservation in order to offset their greenhouse gas emissions. Momback, Regreen, and companies like them are trying a scale of reforestation that has never been tried before. And to do so, they're using techniques borrowed from the paper and pulp and timber industries. Here's Mario Grassi, the head of operations at Momback.
Então, praticamente toda a tecnologia que a gente tem aqui vem da silvicultura de florestas plantadas, né? As plantadeiras, a mecanização do...
He says that they're using techniques from the forestry industry, the planters, the mechanization, the soil preparation that is already integrated with fertilizer. Done properly, reforestation projects like this might have the potential to help the world achieve net zero carbon emissions. The problem is that confidence in the market is very low.
And why is that?
So the voluntary carbon credit market has gotten a very bad reputation in the past few years. You can buy credits that either avoid carbon dioxide from being emitted in the atmosphere in the first place, or that remove it from the air. And a lot of the avoidance credits have come under attack. They often claim to protect standing forest from being cut down, but they have no way of proving that the forest would have actually been cut down in the absence of a carbon credit being issued. So because of these reputation problems, the volume of credits traded on the voluntary carbon market last year was half the number in 2022. And the market's value has shrunk from around $2 billion 2 years ago to less than $1 billion last year. But in Brazil, a lot of people are still optimistic about it.
So why the optimism in Brazil if there's kind of broadly pessimism elsewhere?
So there's 2 main reasons. One is that the founders of these companies told me in future, loads more companies are going to have to buy credits on the voluntary carbon market in order to offset their emissions. So you have some industries like heavy industry or aviation or tech firms that run energy-hungry data centers that won't be able to hit their net zero targets just by reducing emissions. They're going to have to buy credits to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in order to hit those net zero targets. And second, governments around the world are increasingly regulating carbon emissions more and more aggressively. And the voluntary carbon market and regulatory markets can sometimes dovetail.
So markets like that you've seen in Brazil are likely to get bigger and bigger.
Well, that's what the founders of Momback and Regreen are betting on. So right now, around 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide are removed from the atmosphere every year because of human intervention. But the University of Oxford has modeled a bunch of scenarios, and in most of them, it estimates that we will need to remove 7 to 9 billion tons per year in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And if that happens, the carbon removal market could be worth hundreds of billions of dollars, even trillions of dollars. And reforestation is probably the cheapest thing to scale up fast, which makes it attractive in the short term.
And Brazil's just a particularly good place for that because it's got a lot of reforestation it can do?
Brazil is a particularly interesting place to do large-scale reforestation because it has lots of degraded land and the tropical climate promotes growth. So according to McKinsey, restored Brazilian forests could account for 15% of the world's potential for carbon removal through reforestation. And the only other country that could plausibly match that is Indonesia. So if the market takes off and prices for carbon credits rise, then planting trees could become more profitable than rearing cattle.
And I suppose it's just sort of a side benefit that the degraded lands then won't be so degraded.
Yeah, exactly. And if it becomes more profitable to plant trees, then cattle ranchers, even on land that's okay, might consider turning to reforestation. Valedero works as a tree planter for Momback now, but he used to, in his own words, live from the devastation of the forest.
Pra gente que sempre tirou dinheiro devastando, pra gente é diferente.
Now he says, for us, who've always made money from devastation, it's very different for us to make money from planting nature. It's a bit strange for us, but little by little we're getting used to this new market trend. In addition, they might be incentivized because of regulatory changes. Congress right now is discussing a law to create an emissions trading system.
I mean, you're making it sound like Brazil might be single-handedly the solution to the world's problem here.
No, this market needs to scale up all over the world, and it's going to be really hard to make that happen. So first, you need to have better and more standardized ways of measuring the quality of projects. And at the moment, there's a lot of confidentiality around the price that companies are paying per ton of carbon. But beyond that, on reforestation, there are very particular challenges. The biggest hurdle in Brazil is finding legal land to buy. In Brazil, land grabbers often forge titles in connivance with local authorities, and many private owners also lack deeds. Then you have very practical problems no one's talking about. So I talked to Tatiana Shore, who leads a team of Amazon specialists at the Inter-American Development Bank, and she rightly pointed out to me two things no one talks about. One, you don't have enough native bees right now to pollinate all these trees that are going to come into existence. And we don't know how long it's going to take to make their population grow again. And two, you don't have anywhere near the number of greenhouses you need to produce Amazonian trees at scale.
So, in the fullness of the story then, a fair bit of optimism, but also some real reservations about how it all might work. What's the takeaway here? Do you think Brazil is onto something, and will it be followed?
If the carbon price goes up, if there's more standardization, if there's more transparency, then Brazil is really well placed to become a world leader in reforestation for carbon removal. And if that happens, then that'll be really good news for the Amazon and the world, but it'll also be good for business.
Thanks very much for your time, Anna.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
Subscribing to Economist Podcast Plus helps make our journalism possible. Thank you. Search Economist Podcast Plus for a free trial.
When it comes to innovation, you might think that Silicon Valley and the US lead the world, or perhaps an emerging superpower like China. But according to the UN, it's neither of those countries.
Simon Cox is our China economics editor.
The world's most innovative country is, in fact, Switzerland.
Simon, what is going on? I would never have thought Switzerland would be the world innovator.
Is that because you don't own a watch? So this partly reflects the particular index we're looking at. It's according to the Global Innovation Index, which is published by the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is part of the UN. And their ranking partly reflects the definition of innovation they've adopted. It's a broad definition, so it includes many obvious things, scientific publications, for example, the patents you filed. It also includes some inputs to innovation, so the number of researchers you can deploy, R&D spending. There are some weird and wonderful indicators, so the number of movies you have, also the number of comments and changes you make on GitHub, which is a collaborative software and code sharing platform. But the main reason why a country like Switzerland or Sweden, which does very well, can outrank superpowers like the US or China is that a lot of the indicators that this index draws upon are scaled according to the country's economy and its population size. So it's a little bit like those boxing rankings you sometimes see, which try to identify the best pound-for-pound boxer. And sometimes you'll see a welterweight champion coming top of that ranking. And that doesn't mean that they would actually win in the ring with Tyson Fury, but it does mean that given their relatively small size, they're packing a lot of punch.
So just quickly, aside from watches, what is it that Switzerland produces that I haven't thought of, or Sweden for that matter?
So, of course, Switzerland is acknowledged to be a pharmaceutical giant. It has a lot of international patents, especially if you measure relative to the size of its GDP. I was surprised to learn that it makes the most feature films relative to the size of its population. And I mentioned GitHub earlier, this software sharing platform, and apparently the Swiss are particularly active on that platform. One of the nice things about this index is that it gives due weight to technology adoption and diffusion as well as just production. So a country that actually spends a lot on importing technology, spends a lot on intellectual property, payments to the rest of the world, actually can score quite well. And both Switzerland and Sweden do well there. So given the breadth of the definition of innovation, even these small countries can do well, sometimes for quite quirky reasons.
And is that what you're seeing in the rankings? Is it mostly small, wealthy countries that are dominating it?
So the US comes third. You can do well even as a big country, but it's definitely correlated with your GDP per person, so your level of development or your income per person. There's a clear correlation there. But interestingly, there are some countries that do much better than you'd think, given their level of development. The best example is India. Given its GDP per person, which is still really quite low, they should be outside the top 100. But in fact, they rank 39th. Another country like this is China, which is still only an upper middle income country. So it should be in the 60s, but it actually ranks 11th. And there are a number of emerging economies that seem to have done quite well over the last few years. Indonesia is one example, Brazil is another.
Simon, maybe every age likes to think of itself as very innovative, but we certainly talk about ourselves as being so, whether that's sort of the way the smartphone has transformed the world, AI, medical technologies and things. What do these rankings show about the overall health of our current innovation?
You're absolutely right. We always tend to overrate our own innovations and forget the breakthroughs of the past. But nonetheless, we've had a good few years recently. There was an innovation boom in venture capital, patent filing, scientific publications. But interestingly, this innovation index suggests that's come to an end in the past year or two. It may have been associated partly with the pandemic, which obviously stimulated a lot of research in vaccines, also stimulated a lot of technology adoption. People talked about e-acceleration, where we all got to learn how to use Zoom and similar technology products. Also, that was a period you'll remember of easy money. US Federal Reserve had interest rates cut to the bone, which was very good for venture capital and a number of other assets. With high interest rates of more recent period have brought an end to that. We've seen R&D investment by big companies slowing. And we've also, interestingly, seen the number of scientific publications fall. And international patent filings are down for the first time since 2009.
And how much of that is just about slowing economies or anxiety about slowing economies? And how much does that really seem to be a change in the way we're doing things?
So it could be that it's all just a function of the economic cycle. Now that America's Federal Reserve, its central bank, is cutting interest rates, perhaps we'll see a resurgence in venture capital. We've obviously seen some good technological breakthroughs in recent years that should stimulate further research. You think of all of the improvements in batteries, genomic sequencing, computer power. There's a lot of excitement about artificial intelligence, of course. So there are still sources of inspiration that could lead to innovation breakthroughs. But I tend to think that in order for innovation to flourish in a broad sense, you need economies to flourish too. You need confidence. You need people entering scientific fields, hoping to take on some of the big problems facing humanity. And I think all of that works better when people are optimistic about the future rather than hunkering down and looking for the safe option.
Fascinating stuff, Simon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of The Intelligence. Do let us know what you think of the show. You can get in touch at podcasts@economist.com. We'll see you back here tomorrow.